What's up YouTube, Playmatter here, bringing you another video based on forecasting and how not to forecast to your opponent. Time and time again in Yu-Gi-Oh! We hear that knowledge is power. You don't want to give an unfair advantage to your opponent by letting them know too early what you have, how good what you have is, and essentially whether you can stop them or whether you think you're about to win this game. So what is forecasting? It's basically quite literally your poker face, where you make it obvious that you have a good or bad hand to your opponent, and we don't want to do that. Tip number 1. When you have a good hand, and your opponent has some back row, think about your options in terms of making your hand not look like it's incredible. For example, if you were going to summon, let's say, a pike to try and bait their back row, then if you've made it obvious that the rest of your hand is incredible, they're not going to bother. Whereas if you make it look like it's your only play, they probably will try and stop you. Or let's say you're in time of the round, and this is the only card in your hand, and your next draw is another upstart goblin. Now you've probably lost, but hand shuffling won't help. I promise it will not help. So let's talk about hand shuffling for a moment. I think in general hand shuffling is a pretty bad thing to do. You should shuffle your hand so that your opponent doesn't know which card you just drew is where, but it often gives away too much. For example, oh my god, I just drew the best card in the world. That's all well and good, but you really don't want to let your opponent know what's coming before it happens. Alternatively, let's say you do just have a really bad hand. You've just drawn another card that's completely terrible. If you make it look like it's completely terrible and set two bluffs looking like you've already lost the game, then your opponent's not even going to try an MST or try and waste a resource to destroy any of your back row. They're just going to attack and probably go for game. On the reverse side of that, when you are bluffing, whenever they summon a monster, don't hold up your bluff as if you're about to activate it, because then they know it's a bluff. That's another forecast, is always checking your back row far too often. And it just makes it look very obvious that you haven't got anything. You know, they've summoned. Okay, you haven't got anything. They've X, Y, Z summoned. Okay, you still haven't made a response. So they've got two options. They either try and destroy one of your back row before they attack, or they try and attack into your back row. Now, if you're making it too obvious that these cards are bluffs, then they're not even going to bother, they'll just attack, won't they? Another kind of forecasting is the panic button forecasting. So for example, I was in a tournament where a player had set 2 as their first turn. I played quite a few cards to the field and attacked him with no responses from him whatsoever. He then drew 1 card and set 2 more. Now that tells me that he had another card he could have set in his hand and didn't bother, and now it's kind of like he's panicking and wants to make his field look more intimidating. He hasn't drawn a monster, he probably hasn't drawn it out to anything I've got, so I reckon I'm just going to keep summoning and attacking until he responds. If you want your opponent to even be slightly worried about overextending into your field, don't play a card that was in your hand one turn and play a card the next turn if it's a bluff or if it is useless. It's really too obvious to set cards in that way. Here's another of my favourite tips. If you do have 4 cards to set, don't set them in order. Don't decide which one's the best and place them one at a time. You know, often the best one is either the first one you set or the last one you set, the closest to your deck. Or you know, there's all sorts of kind of ideas around which card is usually the best. And players tend to be creatures of habit. So if you play game 1 against someone and you notice that they always place their bottomless trap hole or their best card next to their deck, then you know that that's probably the best one to hit. I personally think that if you're setting cards all at once, you have a look at them, decide you definitely want to set them all, place them face down, and don't spend any special time looking at them. You know, just check where they are, which one's which, and don't continue to look at any individual one more than the others. That way there'll be no forecasting whatsoever as to which is your best one that you've set for your opponent. When you randomise your set cards, there just isn't any way of knowing which one to go for with any form of spell or trap destruction that only targets 1 card. I've seen players do this as well. So they have 2 cards in hand, they set them like this, and then they separate them. Some players do this as a bluff, some people aren't quite as obvious as this, but this card is always going to be the card to hit. This is because they've shuffled it in their hand, they've kept the card they know is the good one at the front, they're playing them face down, overlaid, and they're separating them. So 9 times out of 10, they're going to keep the card that they want to play next, or the one they find important, at the front of those two, which is why I find it really important to randomise your cards that you set at the same time. You really don't want to give away that information to your opponent, because I have won games just because my opponent has set their cards that way. For one reason or another at locals, players tend to show their friends their hands, whether it's to show they've got an amazing hand, like, whoa, look at my hand, or whether they've got a really bad hand. This is a bad thing because both the player and their friend can really give away what's going on in that hand with their facial expressions. Which brings me on to my next subject of facial expressions. You can give away when you've just drawn the best top deck ever.
Yes!
Or we can forecast when we're in a bad position and we've also just drawn the worst card possible. And in general, don't smile at your back rows. Facial expressions can give away a lot, such as when you're bluffing, when you feel you've already lost the game, you really have no response to what they're doing now. And finally for my video, I just want to talk about this concept of not becoming a creature of habit. So if you do something the same way each time, for example, you cut their deck the same way each time, you shuffle their deck the same way each time, you play your cards in a certain way each time, then people can expose that, and that can actually open yourself out to cheaters, which is going to be a discussion of my next video. Please comment, rate and subscribe, and I'll be back with more videos soon. Playmatter signing out.